Thank you and welcome back. This is the third and final installment for the Livable Cities presentation. And here we're going to briefly discuss and try and understand how other cities um, elsewhere in the region have actually managed to achieve livability, and if there's any lessons for the Lao PDR in understanding how other cities have done it so that they can also emulate or replicate or follow the same types of trajectories without duplicating and copying directly. Let's look at three examples, actually four examples. The first one is in Suzhou in Jiangsu province of China. This won the Li Qian Yu World City Prize. And the city of Suzhou was previously extremely dirty, suffering from rapid, unplanned, uncontrolled levels of urbanization. Despite its levels of economic prosperity. So it was able to define a clear city vision, allocate specific budgets, and follow its developmental plans, social, economic, as well as physical, in terms of physical planning, engineering, and urban infrastructure. And this allowed it to transition from a heavily manufacturing, export-oriented economy with an over-reliance on its agricultural hinterland to one that is presently innovative, high value, service orientated, and of course, relies on the talents of its people and its population to achieve both livability and high levels of densities. It also had, like many of the cities in the Lao PDR, uh, celebrated and improved its cultural and historic areas. So there was an internal draw within China as well as regionally for tourism. And as a result, it's been a cultural success as well as an economic success based on these very simple but clearly defined objectives. The second example that I'd like to give is right next door to the country that I live in Kigali, Rwanda. You've heard of Kigali, and it has, of course, a lot of very negative connotations because of the genocide that occurred there in the 90s. But you'd be surprised to know that, and I can attest to this, having walked around Kigali at 3 a.m., it's easily one of the safest cities I've been to anywhere in the world, and I've been to many, many cities. Not only is it extremely, extremely safe, but it's also one of the cleanest cities in Africa. And this is a commitment of the national government as well as the city government committing resources and committing institutions to the idea of a green economy, green development, and sustainability. So it was one of the first countries in the world to institute a plastic bag ban. Its rivers are absolutely clean. A green fund to turn wetlands into what we call urban sinks and urban recreation areas during the drier seasons. And so in the rainy season, it's completely okay if these areas get flooded because what that does is recharge the groundwater aquifers. Its master plan is constantly updated. It's got a long-term vision to 2040. And it's going to be one of Africa's most populated cities by 2050. And as a result, the planning has been put in place now to ensure that by 2050, it can actually manage this population growth and the urbanization process. The third example I'd like to give you is Tianjin Eco City project uh, in Singapore, on the outskirts of Singapore, which is a national level project aimed at becoming a model for sustainable cities. And we don't often think of sustainability when we think of Singapore because of the levels of reclaimed land and the dredging of the sea in order to create reclaimed land. But what it's done is taken on what we call TOD principles, transport-oriented development or transit-oriented development, in order to ensure that transportation hubs are at the cornerstone and fundamentally define the master plan for Singapore. As a result of this, there's an emphasis on green transport. There's an emphasis on non-motorized and non-personal vehicular transport, an emphasis on pedestrian routes and cycle paths throughout Singapore. And all of this has defined other opportunities for industrial, economic, and residential development throughout Singapore. Finally, I'd like to bring about the example of Medellín in Colombia. Medellín, of course, notorious for Pablo Escobar and has been crippled by decades of drug-fueled violence, crime, and corruption. However, that has been reformed um, through a lot of emphasis by the city government on consultation, on engagement of civil society groups, on engagement of various different economic and cultural classes, as well as its labor force and industry and entrepreneurs. It's become extremely socially cohesive, very business friendly, and is now able to afford the residents a higher quality of life than other cities in the region and certainly within Colombia. And this is all attributed to two things: one, visionary leadership and the flexibility of the local government at the municipal level, as well as their commitment to engage the needs of stakeholders and responding to these needs through investments, through municipal budgeting, participatory municipal budgeting, as well as through prioritization of what the city needs for the coming decades. So you see, none of these are beyond the scope of what Lao can actually do, and all of them are very easy to achieve for the three cities in the Livable Cities program that we're trying to achieve in Laos. If we look at Singapore, just reverting back to that example, we had early on in times, 20 or 15 years ago, relatively lower levels of population density, but we also had low levels of livability. And the vision at that time was to develop a garden city, then a city in a garden, then a city of gardens and waters, and now it's a city in nature. And all of these have actually been consistent in terms of a vision. They've been consistent in allowing for planning and budgeting. And as a result, population densities have increased to manageable levels, but livability has also increased accordingly. And so the dynamic approach to livability in terms of Singapore's model is one which can easily be applied in the three cities of Laos. And certainly there's no illusion or recommendation here that we simply follow what Singapore has done, but we want to use Singapore as an example of how city government institutions, you can look at the bottom bubble there, are able to use markets, consult with markets, understand what markets need, and therefore create jobs based on the city residents, its people, its stakeholders, and its constituents within the city to respond to the needs of the markets and the private sector, and to use people as a force, civil society groups, NGOs, as well as individual households, as a force to lobby leadership and to encourage leadership to develop a consensus based on trust, based on political will, and to create the institutions that are necessary to deliver livability and improved urban resilience, as well as improved densities. All of this requires a commitment by city level governments to work with communities and work with stakeholders. And that's absolutely key. And this is something that the three cities in the Lao PDR can do without additional cost and without much additional training. It's just really about a commitment. Here we see a slide, and I'm not going to talk about this in a lot of detail, about Singapore's approach to livability and how the green plan was central to what we see Singapore today. You can see in the bottom left slide that some of the rivers and canals in Singapore were extremely polluted in the 1970s. And this didn't happen overnight, but by 1987, a few 10, 12 years, 15 years on, there was an increased commitment to clean up the Singapore River, as well as a vision that was implemented through coherent and more concrete plans and financing and development of the cleaning imperative there. So the plans, of course, existed. The development plans existed. The master plans existed, just like the plans exist for Luang Prabang and Pakse and Savannakhet. These plans are no different, or the plans of Singapore were no different than the plans that each of the three cities have today. So you've already got the building blocks in place in Laos to develop improved livability, improved resilience, and improved densities. All that's missing are commitments and a vision to look at what types of investments foster livability. And that's really a decision for you to determine, rather than for consultants like us to tell you what to do and what to achieve and how much to budget based on specific budget lines. There's ample room in the budget, as you will find out from this afternoon's midterm presentations. There's ample room in each of the budgets for specifically Pakse and Savannakhet to improve the investments and stage certain initiatives over time to be achieved. And these budgets have not yet been locked. So now is the opportunity to think about what resilience and livability investments you need in order to ensure that the future of your cities are indeed livable, resilient, inclusive, and green, and some of the other things that we've spoken about. So the hope is that you'll take the opportunity to look at less technically engineered approaches, less approaches of pouring concrete and pouring asphalt and building sewer pipes and this type of thing, and more green engineering approaches and harmonizing the investments more in line with naturally engineered solutions. I know that for the sanitary landfill sites, that has certainly been done, but there's an opportunity here to also do it through the roads and through the drainage channels and sewage systems that we're talking about. And the hope is that green engineered solutions will be considered by each of the three cities. If we look again, reverting back to Singapore, and I use this as an example because it's a hub that many of you are familiar with. When you fly out of Laos, more than likely you'd either have to fly to Bangkok or Singapore or KL. And so I use Singapore as a good example because many of you have actually been there. So here's a blue map of Singapore. And what do we mean by the blue map? We mean that the reservoirs, the natural rivers and waterways and drainage systems are actually dovetailed and integrated with the green systems of Singapore. And that's absolutely what we want to try and see and achieve in the three cities of Laos. As a result, Singapore was able to achieve high levels of livability through providing high quality of life, linking of vehicular to non-vehicular traffic, linking these to densities, linking of green water courses to the blue systems and the blue channels. All of these develop integrated, codependent, interreliant systems of livability. And of course, that is absolutely what we want to see in the three cities of the Lao PDR. In these last set of slides, what I'd like to talk about is opportunities to consider how physically incorporate livability into what we're trying to do in these last set of slides. What I'd like to do is try and describe how specifically the three cities of the study can develop and improve livability through the investments and through the options and through the opportunities that the CDIA and eventually a marketplace of donors, including the ADB, can offer. So I'd just like to go through a revision of what we discussed in the first two sets of videos. The first is that there's 5 fundamental aspects of great livable cities, and this is universally to be applied and considered as characteristics globally. First is that they are defined by robust and complete neighborhoods. This means that you can live in one neighborhood, work in the same neighborhood, go to restaurants in the same neighborhood, buy your groceries and food in the same neighborhood. Your children can go to the schools in the same neighborhoods. And all of these are self-defined, complete, coherent neighborhoods within different parts of the city. So that's number one. Number two is absolutely essential, as we've seen in cities like London, Tokyo, and Singapore, is that we've got sustainable forms of mobility which rely on pedestrian as well as public transportation and cycle paths, as well as a decreased reliance on individual motorized transport. Third is that we've got a diverse economic base, which means that industry, labor, the formal and informal sectors of the economy are all interdependent and are diverse. That the city is not just a manufacturing base, for example, for automobiles or telecommunications or electronics, that there's a diversity of skills, there's a diversity of labor, and there's a diversity of economic activities. Fourthly, and I think all of the 3 cities have considered this, but may want to consider broadening this, is that there's a vibrancy of public spaces, which also includes heritage spaces and establishment or reestablishment and definition and improvement of the historic core. All 3 cities have a very culturally relevant and significant historic core, and there should be opportunities to expand that and develop those further, not only for domestic tourist activities, but also for international ones. And finally, of course, all of this has to be affordable, and that the city has to be able to pay for these investments over the long term. So the planners of these cities must have to think about these issues. You've got the physical plans in place and the infrastructure plans in place for the medium term, but also you need to think about them for the term of 15 up to even 25 and 30 years as well. So the second principle is that we need to look at people-friendly streets and streetscapes. These cities, all 3 of your cities, need to consider opportunities for riverfront development, for sidewalks, for parks, for plazas. If you think about Luang Prabang at the moment, the reason why it's a UNESCO Historic Heritage Site can be emulated and replicated and capitalized on in the other cities in the Lao PDR as well, and therein lies a unique opportunity to ensure that the movement of people, to offer places for people to meet and mingle and interact, are capitalized on through environmental and physical infrastructure. And that means ensuring that street design are readily incorporated, that transit opportunities for vehicular as well as non-vehicular, including walking and cycling, are made more direct and safer. And these are clearly opportunities that all 3 cities can capitalize on. Thirdly, and that's related to the second point, is that there's an opportunity for fast and frequent local transit. I've noticed that in each of the cities around rush hour, traffic jams to a standstill, and there are opportunities here for Kaysone, Phomvihane, as well as Pakse and Luang Prabang outside the historic core to incorporate cycle paths, to incorporate direct pedestrian routes, but also to incorporate direct public bus routes. And I'll remind you that in Singapore, we had a TOD approach, a transit-oriented development approach, which, if you remember and can revert to your memories of Singapore now, you will remember that the use of private automobiles is severely curtailed in Singapore because of not only high land values, but also because of road reserve space. And the 3 cities of Laos, in many cases, have bigger road reserves than Singapore, despite having a fifth or a sixth of Singapore's population. Fourthly, that the cities need to be connected through economic, which are not physical, but also transit, which are physical, corridors. The idea of the GMS concept and the connection of the GMS investments that the ADB and even certain others are backing allow for cities within Vietnam, Cambodia, and Thailand to be connected with those within the Lao PDR. And that means that their cities also have to be connected. So what we want to ensure here is that the cities within Lao remain robust, effective, and connected to a series of urban settlements beyond the borders, those within Vietnam, Cambodia, and Thailand as well. And so as a result of this, what we have is transit corridors for the shipments of goods and services, but also economic corridors which facilitate trade and other forms of development, including cultural and intellectual as well as economic exchanges between the countries. Fifthly, we need to consider the idea of supergrids and the opportunities for cycle paths within the cities. And this is something that needs to particularly be borne in mind for Pakse and Kaysone, Phomvihane, Savannakhet, because uh, the grid system at the moment is overly reliant on the use of the automobile. And as we have seen in the past 5 years at least, which is a trend that I expect will continue decades into the future, the reliance on motorized transport, particularly in cities, is probably going to be decreased. And the idea that pedestrian opportunities as well as cycle opportunities must be increased means that we don't need tight grids anymore. And so the idea that the grid pattern can be increased, allowing for back lanes and alleyways that create opportunities for children to play, that create opportunities for mingling and social spaces, allows for livability to be increased as well as densities to be increased. And certainly that's what we want to see achieved in each of the three cities. Sixthly, and I'm coming to the end of the presentation here, we want to, and this is connected to point number 5, I've already spoken about it, is that we want to reduce the reliance on motorized vehicles. Parking takes up a lot of space, particularly in Pakse and Savannakhet, and there's no need for an over-reliance on parking spaces if we're going to be decreasing the use of automobiles. Seventh, we want to look at integrating urban services with zoning and affordability, which means that the city is made available to all incomes, number one, but we also want a diversity in urban services so that people in specific neighborhoods are served based on their ability and willingness to pay for services. If you want waterborne sanitation inside your house, there's a cost to that. But communal sanitation in other parts of Asia are extremely popular and extremely safe if undertaken and delivered effectively. That's not the case in Lao PDR. But the point here is that the vast number of road users or the few number of road users have to pay for the excessive use or the overuse of concrete and asphalt in each of the three cities. And that is extremely difficult and extremely expensive for each of the three cities as a debt service, as a debt burden to maintain for perpetuity. It's simply unfeasible from a financial and economic point of view to be able to afford the maintenance and upkeep of the amount of roads that exist in all three of the cities. And so there's an opportunity here to really look at differing infrastructure choices, whether that's in water supply, sewerage, drainage, and solid waste, but more importantly in roads. Now, understandably, roads are not a key component of this PPS in each of the three cities, but there's really an opportunity here to improve road safety, to ensure that we've got separated use of pedestrian as well as bicycle traffic from that of motorized traffic to ensure that roads are made safer for the vast amount of public users that are going to be increasingly reliant on them for non-motorized uses. Uh, Almost at the end, I want to say here that we need to think about planning for a better future. We need to learn about how we can take the existing physical plans and look at a livability as well as resilience component, because we understand and know, as in presentation number 2, that there are threats that are going to be facing these cities, and the ability of city residents to respond to threats, to respond to shocks, and to respond to stresses is going to become more and more regular over time. As the effects of climate change increase over the coming decades, over the next 50 years, the ability of city residents as well as city infrastructure remains critical in order to look at moving from just a static approach to survival to one that includes thriving under times of economic and physical hardships, such as the COVID-19 pandemic and other crises that we are likely to experience in the coming decades. And finally, we need to look at the financing required for such improvements. Of course, affordability is key, and we know that city stakeholders, city citizens are going to be relied upon to pay for these services. They can't all be absorbed from central government ministries. And of course, even if they were relied upon to be paid for by central government ministries, eventually the taxpayer has to pay for this. So the idea that donor financed and technical support, including but not limited to the ADB, will form a part of this financing requirement. The vast majority of it will fall upon domestic resources to actually pay for in terms of the capital expenditures and the